Hello everyone, I'm the Enforcer, and we are back after the Monday break with the Day 61 and the Day 62 news. The previous 48 hours of the war in Ukraine, and there has been nothing but good news for the Ukrainians as they have managed to once again gain the upper hand over the Russians and have been pushing them back in small areas across the entirety of the front. With that being said, once again, I would like to announce that we have now launched the Enforcer short clips. The first one was uploaded today. It's actually taken about a day longer than I was hoping for, but nonetheless, I actually figured out how to put together a clip, put one together, and send it out. So if you haven't watched it, make sure to do so. I'll be trying to upload 2 of those a day. Of course, the clips will be in tonight's stream, and I hope that y'all do enjoy for some of y'all who may not be able to make it to each night's stream and still want to see some of the highlights of today's news. So with that, let's go over today's schedule. First, we'll be starting off in Kiev. We only have one bit of news in Kiev. It's from Day 61. We will then move to the Bryansk area and cover all of the news that occurred in Bryansk and also in this town of Cheboksary, I believe. I'm sorry if I can't pronounce that well. I'm not really good with Russian city names, but nonetheless, we saw some interesting news there, and we will cover that as well. We will then move to the location unknowns, which we have a huge amount of today, and we're actually going to do something a little different. We're actually going to cover the Day 62 news on its own, and before we move on to the Day 61 location unknowns, we're actually going to answer 3 to 5 questions from the chat, just so that way we can make sure that some people get their questions answered and get recognized for supporting the channel, and also so that way I'm not talking for too long in one uninterrupted stretch. We'll then cover the Day 61 location unknown news. Then we shall move on to the Kharkiv area, where we'll talk about the news that has occurred around Kharkiv. We will then move further on down the front towards the Izium area and also the northern part of the Donbass around Luhansk. We will then pause to take another 3 to 5 questions from the chat. We will then move on to the Donetsk area, as well as pretty much the entirety of the Zaporizhia and the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, I believe is the correct pronunciation of that. We will then, of course, cover the small amount of news that has now come out of Mariupol, which I'm very glad to report on. We will then move on over, once again, into the Zaporizhia area, cover the news that occurred somewhere in the area of Kherson from what we could collect today, the Odessa news, and also the Novorossiysk news. And then that rounds out the news for today, and we'll go into the question segment, which will encompass the remainder of the stream. Nonetheless, I'm very happy to have all of y'all on. It's good to get back from the break. And to be honest with y'all, while the breaks are good, I don't know what to do on that night when I'm not streaming, because I'm like in the streaming mode 24/7, and so I'm like, well, what do I do? And so I'm like sitting around and I'm like watching like Seinfeld or TV or playing a computer game or something. I'm like, wow, this is meaningless. But anyways, we're not going to talk about that too much. We're going to get straight into the news now. Starting off in Kiev, we've seen that 5 American congressmen have arrived in the city today and are apparently meeting with the Ukrainian government. I'm not exactly sure the specific names of these congressmen and women. We can see that there is one woman in the group, but nonetheless, it is good to see that more and more American politicians are actually rounding their way into the Ukrainian territory and actually making visits there. That's something that we did not see for the first 2 months of the war, but now as the war has progressed, just a few days before this occurred, we actually saw the Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, arrive in Ukraine to talk to President Zelensky directly, and now we've seen 5 more Ukrainian congressmen and women arrive in the country to discuss things with the Ukrainian government. Of course, we don't know exactly what they're talking about, but nonetheless, I do feel like it's going to be making more progress than any kind of telecommunications and video calls that we've seen over the past few months. So once again, incredibly good to see, and we know that America has been taking the forefront in the amount of military aid that has been supplied to the Ukraine. The United States, if I'm remembering these numbers correctly, as far as it was in March, had supplied more military aid than every single other country in the world combined. So I'm very happy to know that, and I'm very happy to know that the United States has stepped up to the plate and is ensuring that weapons are making it into Ukrainian hands, which can then promptly destroy the Russian invaders. Once again, incredibly good to know. And with that, we're now going to move on out of the Ukraine for a bit, and we're going to move into the city of Bryansk, where we've seen a couple of interesting occurrences happen. First off, knowing that I'm a huge logistics guy, y'all can understand why I would care about this kind of thing. But we actually saw a military train derail near Bryansk, somewhere in one of the surrounding depots. So I'm going to let y'all see this video. Unfortunately, it turns into a slideshow. I know, I'm sorry about that. But nonetheless, you can see that the cars have derailed, and it actually looks like one of them, or several of them, have overturned. As you can see, the axles are upright, but the cars themselves are flipped over. Derailments are a serious issue when talking about railroad operations. We can actually see what it looked like at T-72 right there in that slideshow, that it flipped over. But nonetheless, let me explain why this derailment is important. And while it's a minor occurrence, it's not anything major that's going to stop the war in its tracks. It's still incredibly important to talk about. A derailment in a rail yard, kind of like we saw, well, it really didn't look like a rail yard. It looked like a double-tracked, normal main line. But nonetheless, a derailment is a serious issue because it takes hours, if not sometimes a day or two, to clear up, and on top of that, it occupies that entire rail the entire time. So let me explain with a couple of drawings what that means. Let's say that the derailment happened here, and there was a switch somewhere up here. That's getting a little too technical, but anyways, the train encompasses this area of track, and we'll put this down as the derailed train. All right, so we're going to color that one purple or pink, just a very bright color. And so it's now occupying that one side of the line. And so all the other train traffic that is coming through that area starts to pile up because they all have to pass, instead of northbound traffic and southbound traffic in this instance, in this example, moving on the independent tracks, they now have to take turns passing through this one track. And so that's going to start creating a traffic jam of trains, pretty much, that is unavoidable, and there's really no way to fix. So for this time, for the short time that this derailment will be occupying the track, it is buying up valuable time that the Russians could be using transporting the small amount of resources that we know they're logistically able to. So that is, of course, incredibly good news. Of course, it's not going to be war-changing news, but nonetheless, it is putting a hamper in their logistical situation towards the northern side of the Ukrainian front. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news in Bryansk, where we can see that the fire from the oil depots that caught on fire the other day is still ongoing. In this footage here, you can actually see the plumes of smoke billowing out of the burning oil that's been left all over the ground. Of course, the damaging of oil silos is incredibly detrimental to both sides, as it does weaken and sometimes entirely deplete their oil reserves in a certain area. So once again, incredibly good to see that the Ukrainians have struck a major strategic resource of the Russians, although I believe for the Russians this is less of a concern, considering they're having large amounts of oil pulling up inside of their country, because there's really no viable export markets anymore, rather than Germany and some of the eastern countries like China and the post-Soviet countries like the Stan series of countries, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and so on. Nonetheless, we're now going to move on to the last bit of news. This is still, of course, about the Bryansk oil depot explosion, and we have gotten confirmation that the Ukrainians have, in fact, stricken these Russian oil silos. As we can see here in this video, we can see that a missile hit the silos, which clearly shows that it was a Ukrainian ballistic missile attack. So the Ukrainians, in fact, do get the credit for another successful raid on Russian supplies, and will hopefully continue to do this well into the future, as this will put a damper on the Russian logistical efforts, which we already know have pretty much fallen apart at this point, as their logistical units have probably suffered around 1/4 of their initial, I guess, supply force has been lost in combat. So nonetheless, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news outside of Bryansk, and we're now going to move deep into Russia, into the town that I tried to pronounce earlier called Cheboksary. Nonetheless, and I'm sorry for saying nonetheless so much, but bear with me, y'all. We can actually see a man kick a giant Z. I don't know how the Russians managed to build one of these so quickly. It, of course, looks like it was a very easy thing to build. It's just a large Z. But it's really weird to me that the Z has pretty much become the symbol of Russia in this war, kind of like the swastika was the symbol of the Germans in World War II. So I'm going to let y'all see this video of the guy kicking it. Apparently, he got arrested for this, which is, as you can see there, kind of solid kick. Unfortunately, it didn't do anything to the C. Apparently, it's made out of something a little bit stronger than what the Russian tanks are made out of. But it's still crazy to me that the guy was brazen enough on camera to go up and kick it, knowing he'd probably be arrested. It's good to see that there are a few Russians out there that still do not support what their government is doing, although unfortunately it seems like the large majority of them have either been misinformed or willingly support what the Russians are doing. With that, we're now going to move on from the news inside of Russia, and we're now going to jump back into Ukraine and start covering the day 62 news, which is today, and all of the location and unknowns it had. We will, of course, cover the day 62s as well, colored in blue, but first, before we get to any of that, there's this little lime green marker here, and some of you who have been return viewers on my stream may have remembered the Chechen who got shot in the back. I actually found out that he was shot in his plate carrier. He had a plate carrier on his back, and we all saw him fall to the ground and start grimacing and rolling around and crying and stuff. And while, you know, it's kind of an understandable response, you know, getting shot in the back probably doesn't feel great, I actually found a video from 2004 of an American being shot in his plate carrier on his back in Iraq, and look how well he responded to it, and remember how poorly the Chechen responded to it. So I'm going to let y'all see this video. As we can see, there's an American in front of a Humvee, and actually he gets shot at the very start of this video. Of course, the American soldier in this video wasn't severely wounded. He probably had some kind of heavy bruising on his back. But anyways, we do know that he was fine, because if you watch... Also, let me mute that. He gets up immediately, and he takes off. Alright, now that's in comparison to the Chechen who got shot in the back, and he immediately fell down, like the American kind of did for a second, you know, trying to regain his breath, I'm assuming, and then get up and run. He just laid down and started, you know, going, ah, my back, and when you look at, I mean, like, that's understandable, but when you look at how this soldier responded to being shot in the back, and then you look at him, it kind of makes him look like a wimp. Of course, there may have been different calibers used. It could have been a different kind of plate carrier. Maybe it didn't absorb the shock of the hit as much, you know, and so more of the hit got the guy and it winded him or something. But nonetheless, that's how you would expect someone to take a shot when they have a plate carrier on. The whole point of a plate carrier is to pretty much keep the soldier going, even if he does get shot, or at least, you know, mitigate the wound enough that he can be treated. But anyways, I digress. Just wanted to show that because I found it very interesting when you compare the Chechen versus the American here. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the day 62 location unknown news. Starting off, we can see some footage of a firefight. This is, of course, in the standard practice. We've seen loads of this kind of footage. But anyways, I'm going to let y'all see it. We're not exactly sure where this is from. It says POV footage from the battle in Kiev, but it hasn't been published. And we never really had any actual confirmation on where this came from, and I looked through the comments on this post, and no one really knew where it was from. So, it's a location unknown. As we can see, the Ukrainians are appearing to lay down fire outside of that window on the second floor of this store, of this warehouse, perhaps. And we can also see that the operator here, who has the camera, is using some kind of binocular set. We can now see the Ukrainian doing a pretty good job, actually, at parkour. I'm pretty impressed with that. Oh, wow, look at this. Wow, that guy was legit. That guy was, I was joking about the parkour, but that man was seriously about to go through some really hardcore parkour. But nonetheless, very interesting video to see, and it's very weird and odd because we don't really see a lot of footage of the Ukrainians operating inside of their own country. To see how the Ukrainians are engaging the Russians in firefights, like doing crazy things like climbing on top of roofs, and we can see there that they got into an inaccessible area apparently in this warehouse. So with that, we're now going to move on to the next video where we see Ukrainian soldiers under artillery barrage. Of course, the location is unknown. It says Eastern Ukraine, but as of now, the entirety of the remainder of the war is in Eastern Ukraine, so we don't really have an idea of where this was exactly. But nonetheless, here's the footage. As you can see, the shells are starting to land all around them in this barrage. It seems like this soldier in particular is laying low. Of course, an incredibly smart idea when you're getting barraged. Hopefully most of his unit got out of it safe. It looked like the barrage actually landed short of their line, about 50 yards or so. So hopefully he was safe. An interesting video regardless. And it's very interesting to hear how calm and collected he is, although they just saw a barrage land right on top of him. We now hear what sounded like another blast in the distance. What's crazy to me, and you never really think about it, is that Ukraine, like when you think of the steppes, because this is kind of getting into the region called the steppes, you never really think it'd be that flat. But this is about as flat as Wyoming. If you've ever been out to Wyoming, that place is flat. And it's crazy to me to think that a war is being fought on such flat and open ground. It's really amazing to me, considering that how well the Ukrainians have been able to hold their ground, since armor works very well in large open spaces like this. But then again, we know that the Russians attacked during the Rasputitsa, which has relegated most of the armored units to the roads. Anyways, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see another Stugna attack. The Ukrainians love the Stugnas. They used them constantly, and we can see here that once again they have another happy customer. As you can see, the tank fired. The Stugna is on its way, and it hit the tank dead on the side, knocking it out. Once again, an incredibly good video. It's good to know that the Ukrainians continue to inflict that demoralizing damage on the Russians, because the Russians simply, from what we can tell on video footage, can hardly operate a tank in an open area without it being destroyed by some kind of anti-tank guided missile. And this has led to the argument about the obsolescence of main battle tanks in modern warfare. But I'm not going to weigh into that. I don't really feel like I'm an expert. Anti-tank weapons, since the beginning of their inception, have usually done incredibly well at their job. The bazooka, of course, could actually wipe out a King Tiger at a close enough range. So that gives you an idea of how effective anti-tank weapons have been throughout history. So considering the historical context, I'm not really sure if main battle tanks are obsolete yet, but one would assume that with this kind of footage coming out of tanks getting leveled by ATGMs constantly, I'm not really sure if the main battle tank will have as sure of a future as it does now. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we see a Russian vehicle struck by Ukrainian artillery. Apparently, this specific Russian vehicle was inside of some kind of park in a destroyed town, and the artillery still managed to single it out and start battering the thing where it was. As we see, the BMP, from what it appears to be, is moving around the sides of the park, kind of on the paved road areas of the park. We can now see another bit of footage. I'm assuming that it is now moved out of the park. Yes, it looks like it has now moved down towards this church. We can now see the artillery coming down near the APC. Stand by. Wait a minute. Let me go back and look at that again. I can't tell if the APC is still there. I think it may have hidden in the enclave on that building. But nonetheless, I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to let the chat decide that. But nonetheless, it does look like another APC may have taken damage. I can't really confirm because I can't really see it myself in the video. But the Ukrainian artillery is working incredibly well in most situations. I'm not really sure if it was in that situation, but as we move on to the next video, you'll see that it is the case that Ukrainian artillery is deadly accurate. Here's footage, of course, of a Mitsa artillery piece firing. I believe this is a Mitsa B. And so I'm going to rewind so that way y'all can see this from the start and hear the boom of the gun. And with that, we're now going to move on to the next video, where we can see Ukrainian artillery hitting a Russian tank. Now, this is a video that I've been thinking about this entire time. You can see here that there's a large column moving down this road near this tree line, and the Ukrainian artillery pretty much batters all of them into oblivion. You can actually see one here already burning out as the footage begins. So I'm going to unmute this, let y'all see it from the start. As you can see, another artillery shell just landed directly onto a Russian vehicle, which has now caused it to begin to brew up. But we can already see another Russian tank already burning out at the start of this video. That is something, really, when you think about it. How effective and how accurate the Ukrainian artillery is. And I'm assuming it may be because of the drones being used as artillery spotters, considering that the drones can be operated right by the artillery pieces. So instead of having to play a game of telephone where a spotter is on a call with an artillery officer and telling them how to adjust the aim. The drone operator can be right there with the artillery, telling them on the spot how to adjust the fire. So I think that may be helping out the Ukrainians a large deal, and we've seen the Russians trying to implement similar tactics on their side since the war has now progressed, but it doesn't look like they're taking a complete advantage of the usage of drones and their ability to spot for the artillery. With that, we're now going to move on to the next video where we can see a Russian jet that may have been shot down by a Ukrainian Su-25. Of course, I'm not entirely sure. We didn't see it get shot, but what we can see in this video is the Russian jet smoldering and slowly descending into the ground. And of course I have to mute it because there's copyrighted music. It's the interstellar music. But we can see now, I'm not really sure if that was the pilot ejecting or a piece falling off the plane, but now we can see Ukrainian Su-25 hurtling itself towards the burning Russian plane that is now falling to the ground in the distance. As you can see in the video, the Ukrainian Su-25 was incredibly close to the Russian aircraft that got shot down, so I'm not entirely sure if the Ukrainian Su-25 baited the Russian plane into coming into an air defense sector where the Ukrainians then shot it down with surface-to-air missiles, or if the Ukrainian Su-25 managed to shoot down the Russian aircraft itself. I'm not entirely sure, but if it is the latter, that is amazing that an Su-25 has managed to shoot down a Russian aircraft. Of course, I'm not entirely sure what kind of aircraft the Russian one was, but an incredible video nonetheless. Very interesting for sure. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see that some Russian Marines are not faring so well. It appears that the pride of the Russian naval infantry may be doing incredibly poorly. As we can see here, a firefight is ongoing, and we can see one of the soldiers here on the road crawling using his arms to try and get himself off the road. We can also see some more Marines over here where my mouse cursor is circling. And this guy is not using his legs, so I think that may suggest that he has been paralyzed from at least the waist down. Nope, I'm sorry, correction. Apparently he just wasn't using his legs because now he's gotten up and he's actually just crawling away. But as we can see that their advance across this open area near this building is apparently not succeeding because they've now had to retreat under withering fire. What's most interesting to me is that we can actually see the faint watermark of Russia Today. Russia Today has posted footage showing that a Russian advance is not faring well.
Потому что при попытке перебежать эту улицу был ранен один из морпехов, скорее всего, Тихоокеанского флота. Но выдержки у него хватило. Он под огнем, получается, снайпером и под прикрытием своих преодолел дистанцию, наверное, метров 50. Прополз.
We can hear the Russian talking. Of course, I'm not sure what he's saying, but you can see that the defenders, whatever unit this is that's defending this area, is apparently doing an incredibly good job, because the Russians, and as I saw in the chat, apparently he was doing a pretty good low crawl. They were, of course, having to withdraw from their advance because of the withering fire. So I've got to say, very impressive to see that the Ukrainians on film, in fact, footage made by the Russian side, are actually defending incredibly well. That's a lot of credit to the defenders in that specific area, and hopefully they can continue to hold like that for the foreseeable future, hopefully the rest of the war. We know that for the most part, actually, and I'm not going to say too much because we actually have 47 pieces of news tonight, the largest amount ever on stream. It looks like the Ukrainians aren't actually holding anymore. They're actually pushing the Russians back once again in most places. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see that we've apparently had an Easter holiday Uragan firing, because this man, every time he's firing a rocket inside of his Uragan, is saying Christ is risen. So very, very neat video. But anyways, I'm going to let it play.
Христос воскрес! Христос воскрес! Христос воскрес! Слава Украине!
This guy is hitting every single phrase that you can. He said, "Glory to Ukraine, Christ is risen." This guy is running the board, and I like that. That was pretty funny. And of course, I like the patriotism and also the kind of like the clinging to the cultural values of Ukraine. Of course, the Ukrainians are very proud people of their cultural history, and I highly suggest that any of y'all who may be interested in the history of Ukraine go and check out videos on it, because I have to say, when you really look at the entire history of Ukrainians as a people, it is one of the most interesting and colorful histories that I've ever seen. But I'm going to cut that a little short, and we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see a shell landing close to a Ukrainian minder and his dog. Of course, he has a very sweet-looking German Shepherd, or some kind of Belgian Shepherd. I'm a huge fan of both of those breeds, used to have one, and they're incredibly good dogs. It looks like it was close, but of course they lived to see another day, which I'm very happy to know. And look at that dog. Now that's a pretty German Shepherd right there, if that is one. It may be a Belgian Shepherd. I'm not really good with identifying the two. But with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see the Ukrainian pilots asking for American jets. This is the first time I've ever seen on film the Ukrainians asking for American aircraft instead of former Soviet aircraft. I'm not really sure if this is indicating that the Ukrainians have been cross-trained on American jets somehow, in some way, but in this video we can clearly see them asking for American fighter jets, which is very interesting to me.
Я переможець кількох авіашоу у Європі. Демонстрував фігури вищого пілотажа на Су-27. Мій друг і наставник, легендарний пілот АС Олександр Оксанченко, який перед цим представляв Україну на цих шоу, загинув 25 лютого у небі Києва. Навіть вищий пілотаж такого рівня не врятує від ракет окупантів. Нам потрібні сучасні літаки, щоб протистояти ворогу в повітрі. Американські фалькони F-15, F-16, може і F-18 було б достатньо, щоб схилити перевагу на наш бік. Адже ці літаки мають потужні бортові радари, технологічне обладнання, а головне ракети з активними головками самонаведення. У нас є план дій щодо максимального швидкого перенавчання пілотів та інженерно-авіаційний персонал. Для того, щоб швидко опанувати цю техніку, рішення треба приймати вже зараз, щоб не було запізно.
Very interesting to me, because we've never heard the Ukrainian pilots, anyone representative of the Ukrainian Air Force, asking until this video, as far as I know, for American fighter jets. Unfortunately, I don't believe that will happen. We know that the United States and Russia are kind of in almost a Cuban Missile Crisis sort of standoff between the shipment of military aircraft of any kind from Western countries into Ukraine. So I'm not even sure if any Western aircraft, rather than Romania's MiG-21s, which have already, I believe, arrived in Ukraine, would make it there. But nonetheless, I am glad to see that the Ukrainians are very competent, apparently, and willing to test their, I guess, knowledge and prowess by taking on entirely new weapon systems in the middle of a war. I'm not really sure if the Americans would double down on that and agree to send over American fighter aircraft, but if they did, I'm sure that would give the Ukrainians the upper hand and the advantage in any kind of situation they would find themselves against a Russian aircraft in. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news, where we can see Ukrainians inspecting the remains of an Su-34. We'll also be getting to the actual video of this crash here on day 61's news, but here is the news from day 62 of the remains of the crash. Once again, incredibly wonderful to see. This is an Su-34, which is Russia's smaller sized tactical bombers based off of the Su-27 airframe. But as you can see there, it has, of course, crashed and burned, and it's a great thing to see that it is, once again, another Russian aircraft that can be added to the list of kills that the Ukrainians have managed to do against the Russian Air Force. Incredible to see, and with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we've seen the cactus. If y'all may remember a while ago, Walmart here in the United States, if my international viewers don't know, Walmart is our version of a superstore. The British have a version of Walmart called Asda, so I'm sure they'll probably know what I mean, but Walmart had a cactus toy thing, and when you pushed a button, it would sing this Polish song, and what they didn't know is that the Polish song was about taking, like, meth and stuff like that, and so the Ukrainians actually managed to get one of these, and they were laughing at it too, because it's pretty hilarious, I guess, to everyone, especially them, so I'm gonna let the video play. It's pretty funny.
Люди, це передова, щоб ви розуміли. Русский корабль пошел нахуй.
As you can see, they're having a lot of fun with the cactus toy. Everyone had a lot of fun with it here in the United States, too, the people who bought it before it was discontinued. So I'm happy to see that the soldiers are having a pretty good bit of fun up there, even with stuff like this, which I don't even know how they found it. It must have been a really rare find. Maybe not over there in Ukraine, but it was a pretty funny video to see. With that, we're now going to move on to the last 2 bits of location unknown news, and then we're going to move on to our first question segment of the night, which we will, of course, try and get through a little bit quickly. But with that, we can see that the sun shined early somewhere in Ukraine as a Russian tank went up like a Roman candle in the middle of the night and lit the place up like it was day. So I'm going to let y'all see this video. As you can see, Russian T-72B3 was down there, and now it's turned into a small star. Good to see. I'm sure that the Ukrainians actually got to take a good look at where the Russians were at that moment, because it probably looked like noon in the middle of the day after that thing blew up. So it's good to see that the Ukrainians, of course, are taking out the Russians, in fact, at all times of the day. I thought that most of the fighting on both sides was relegated to the daytime, but we can see in this one instance, they actually got a kill in the middle of the night. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of footage, the last bit of location unknown news, where we can see an old face in a new war. As we can see, this man is incredibly old, also has a lot of class smoking this pipe. Gotta say, gotta give him a lot of credit. I like the look. But nonetheless, this picture must have been taken a while ago because he is in snow, and we know that the Ukrainians have not had a lot of snow, although the temperatures have plunged recently to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is -2 degrees Celsius. Nonetheless, this man right here, like, pretty much to me, embodies the look of what you would think a Cossack would be. So that's a neat picture to me. Hope you all agree. And with that, we have reached the end of the day 62 location unknown news. So real quick, we're going to answer 3 questions from the chat, and then we'll return right back to the day 62 news. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
So good evening, everybody. As Enforcer Matt once again. Real quick before I say the questions, I just want to recognize that many people are saying that they have received their merch, and I'm very pleased to hear that it is arriving in good shape and that everything is good with it. So thank you very much for supporting the channel by buying the merch. As always, if you want to check it out, it is down in the description. So first up, I want to recognize a $20 donation from Martin Haig. Thank you very much for your donation to the channel. We appreciate it very much, Martin. Next up, we have a $20 donation from Bass Girl, who is a longtime channel supporter, who says, "You guys are amazing. Thank you for your dedication and giving us the real news. Slava Ukraine."
Thank you so much for the support, and also Heroam Slava. I know there's someone down there in the chat who's like, "Oh, you saying it wrong." I'm sorry, I don't speak Ukrainian, so I can't get it right. But nonetheless, I do thank you so much for the support, Bass Girl. You've been around for a pretty decent while now, of course, supporting the channel. And all the support that we get here means a lot, because it does help us to continue doing our operations here, making streams, now running the shorts, and also making the video in the background that we finally got the whole script made for. It's like 2,600 words. It's a huge script. Like if we double space the thing, it's like 10 pages, but hopefully that video will turn out well, and I thank you so much for the support. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And up next, we have a $20 donation from longtime channel supporter Will Riley, who says, "Do you believe that the British SAS are operating in Ukraine? Also, Dick Cheney is starting a new treaty organization. Dick, devoted international clan of the Kick-Ass."
Well, thank you very much for the support, and I also like the joke. That's a pretty funny one. To answer the question, we don't really have enough information to know if the SAS is operating inside of Ukraine or not. We do know about the political situation, though, and we know that the Western nations, specifically the leading ones like the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, as well as Germany, aren't doing anything to actually actively get involved with their own soldiers inside of Ukraine, as far as we know on paper. So as far as the political situation, I don't believe that that would be the case. It would be highly unlikely, but then again, we haven't gotten any information to disprove or prove that the SAS is operating inside of Ukraine. So I hope that kind of answers the question in a way, and with that, we're going to move on to our last question of this segment, and then we're going to return to the day 61 news.
And just real quick, I did see a comment that somebody said, "Matthew, do you only do questions when people give you money?" And no, we do questions at the end of every stream, just from our live chat. So feel free to put them in using @the Enforcer, and we will try to answer as many as we can. as soon as we get done with the super chats. We like to do our super chats first, so we recognize our channel supporters, and then we get to our live chat questions. So next up, the last one for this segment comes from Mech Tactical, who puts in a $12 donation and says, "Did you hear about why Zelensky won't travel by chopper? He doesn't trust the chopper to handle the weight of his giant balls. Glory to the heroes."
Well, I like that everyone's using the super chats to send in jokes tonight. That's actually pretty good, and I like that one. And I thank you so much for the support. It does, of course, help us to run this channel, and of course, help us to hear good jokes like that. So I like that. Thank you very much once again. And with that, we have reached the end of this question segment. If you would like to throw in a question in the chat, make sure to throw in one. If you would like to get a question answered and also support the channel, that's what the super chats are for. Just wanting to let y'all know again, just in case we have some new viewers who may be wondering, do you have to always pay to get a question answered, just like Matthew said? No, you don't. You can actually just ask a normal question in the live chat, and we will answer some of those at the very end of the stream, the best ones we can pick out. So make sure to stay around. If you do ask a question, you may be one of the lucky people who got their question answered. With that, we're now going to move on to the Day 61 location unknown news. With this, we can see the Russian Special Forces firing a Lynx. I don't really have a lot of information on this specific system, so I unfortunately cannot talk about it in great depth, but we can see them using the RPO Lynx. As we can see, he's now moving up to the spot he's going to fire from, climbing up on what appears to be the foundation of a destroyed house or some surrounding building around it. He's now stood up, and he has now fired the RPO. You can actually see the strength of the backblast because it blows apart this little area of wall behind him that was still standing, as you can see here. Absolutely took the thing apart. And that kind of gives you the idea of how powerful backblast is and why you never want to stand behind that kind of system when it's being fired. You will get blown apart. Well, that's the end of that video. We're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we've seen an Iskander launcher in operation. We have seen a couple of these videos, but of course this one included more footage, which is of course very interesting to see, and it is always interesting to see mechanically how a lot of the weapons being used in this war actually works on film. So with that, here's that video. So you see here the Iskander launcher is moving through the field to its a setup location, I'm assuming. We now see the lid being taken off of the Iskander silo. The Iskander is now being prepped for launch, which takes a little bit of time, but this isn't really a long amount of time in military terms. And we can now see the Iskander firing. Most likely to go into a residential sector in some large Ukrainian city and killed an untold amount of Ukrainian civilians, of course, because that's pretty much all we've seen the ballistic and cruise missiles being used for during this war. With that, that's the end of that footage. Of course, it's interesting to see how the system works. And with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can actually see the Russians trying to save the pilot of, well, the pilots, most likely, of the downed Su-34 we saw on Day 62. So here's that footage, if it loads. Just wanting to not load. I'm going to give it a minute. I'm a patient person. There we go. So now we've got it. As we can see here, the smoke is billowing out of the Su-34's wreckage, but you now see an Mi-8 flying up, popping flares, and getting as close as it can to the crash site to hopefully try and evacuate the pilots. At least that's what the Russians are hoping for. I'm not really sure how that evacuation went. We didn't really have a lot of information whether the pilots were found and evacuated or not, but nonetheless, that is all we have from that video. And with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see the Su-34, correction, using an X-29 air-to-ground missile. We're not exactly sure if the Su-34 that has been seen as the crashed Su-34 on film, and also the Su-34 that was having to have its pilots evacuated due to being shot down, is the same Su-34 in this video. Regardless, these videos were taken around the same time, and as far as the evacuation of the pilots by Mi-8, that video and this video happened on the exact same day. So I'm not sure if this is the same Su-34. It may be, or they may be two entirely separate Su-34s. But we can see that Su-34 tactical bombers are being used in a pretty sizable amount, probably more than any other Russian aircraft we've seen during the war. We get more footage of these than anything else. We can now see the plane firing the X-29. We can now see it popping a flare and another flare. Actually, that was a series of flares. And we now see it launching an intermittent amount of flares. It now looks like it's trying to get out of the area. We can now see it pulling a hard left turn. And it looks like it's actually circling. I'm sorry, now it's straightened down its flight, and it's now heading away from its target that it fired the X-29 at. With the end of that video and hearing that man's beefy voice, now I wish I had a voice like that guy, but with the end of that video, we could see the X-29 being fired and the Su-34 evacuating the area unharmed as far as that video went. And the next bit of location unknown news, we can now see an Su-34 in a flat spin. I'm not sure if these are the same videos, but regardless, that it was an Su-34 firing an X-29 missile on day 61, and then on day 61, we saw an Su-34 in a flat spin that was so bad the pilots couldn't even recover the aircraft and had to eject. So I'm not sure if this was all the same Su-34, but if it is, this is a hilarious ending to their pretty much sortie, to fire an X-29 and then promptly put their plane into a flat spin and crash it. A flat spin is only achieved through the pilot. That's not something that a weapon inflicts. That plane was probably not hit by any kind of surface-to-air missile. It was some kind of maneuver that the pilot pulled that pretty much whipped the aircraft out of its airfoil, and then it just started to go into its flat spin towards the ground. And those are largely unrecoverable. You can recover from a flat spin, though, if you know how, but apparently those pilots didn't, because we saw them bail out of the jet, or maybe they were too low to properly recover from the spin, but nonetheless, the Russians apparently lost an Su-34 today from incompetence alone, from what we can tell on this video. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see a Russian tank stuck in the mud getting blasted by artillery. This once again shows you how deadly effective Ukrainian artillery is, as you can see, the first shot, once I get this video up and started from the beginning, lands directly behind and to the right of the Russian tank, just a few feet away. As you can see right there, it was nearly a dead-on hit. I'm not exactly sure if that was the first shot that the Ukrainians took, because it does appear that there are other craters surrounding the tank, but I'm not sure if those were made on other days. But that specific blast from that one shell was just a couple of feet away from the tank, and if it had just been a couple of more feet behind and more to the right of where it landed, it would have hit the tank dead on, and it would have detonated the ammo and most likely killed the crew as well. So the Ukrainians were incredibly close to getting another Russian tank. I'm not sure if they damaged it to the point that the Russians abandoned it. We couldn't really tell in that video. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see the Ukrainians get fired at and fire back. This seems like a little bit of an artillery battle here, because the explosion we heard sounded like it came from some kind of enemy artillery piece, whether it be mortar or an actual howitzer. I'm not exactly sure. But we can then see, after they receive the fire, they return the fire, as this guy in the video is carrying around this mortar shell the entire time just to get to the mortar and then fire it.
Сука. Підари. За Житомир,
Now we can see them firing back, and the mortar fires.
сосать хуйца, нахуй.
Hopefully that one was a more direct hit than what the Russians were achieving, but a very interesting video, and it's actually an unfolding of an artillery battle in between this mortar unit and the enemy artillery unit somewhere in the distance. A very interesting video, something that we have not seen before, as you know, in being a direct artillery battle in between two units. So with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news from day 61, where we can see that a Stugna unit apparently went on a kill streak, as we can see in this video through this montage. All at one time, this Stugna, which is actually the export version called the Skiff with the Arabic interface, actually destroyed multiple Russian vehicles in a row. So I'm going to let y'all see this footage. It's incredibly interesting. As we see there, I'm not exactly sure what kind of vehicle that was. It looked more like a Russian T-72 or a T-80 instead of an APC.
Внимание! Господи, спаси нас. Выстрел!
We can now hear the order given to fire. The Stugna has now fired. I call skiffs Stugnas because they're the same thing. It's just a different name. We can now see them guiding the Stugna to the tank. And they hit the tank dead on, and the tank exploded into a ball of fire. So that tank was certainly wiped out entirely, maybe with the crew as well. We can now see the Stugna re-aiming. The camera is pretty shaky, apparently, on the interface. Not exactly sure why. It's very weird. We can now see that they have stabilized the Stugna. Wait a minute, I believe that it was shaking around because it was being reloaded in the process of spinning. Because it sounded like there was kind of like a interaction in between two of them where it sounded like they had reloaded the Stugna, and then once you heard that, the shaking on the camera stopped. So that may have been what that was about. We can now see the Stugna getting ready to hit its next target. We can see that they found it in the tree line. They are now aiming the Stugna above the tank in the usual fashion. I'm not sure if that's so that way they don't laze the tank and let the tank's defense systems know that it's being lasered and from where. But now we can see that they fired the second Stugna around in this video, and they're now guiding it down onto the tank. We can now see that that was, once again, another kill. We can now see the Stugna's camera shaking around. I'm assuming that that must be the reloading process. That is someone up there reloading the Stugna's launcher with another anti-tank guided missile. And as you can see right there, I think I'm correct in that assumption, because after the interaction is done where they say a line of words to the operator behind the camera, behind this operator on the actual interface, we can then see that the camera stops shaking. So I am assuming that that is them reloading the Stugna. We now see him, of course, keeping it high in the tree line. This is, of course, the normal tactic. We can see that they've apparently assessed the next target. Wait a minute, I think, because we actually just saw him put the crosshairs dead on the tank, and then he lifted it up. And if it wasn't to not laze the tank, he just defeated the purpose right there. I think the reason why they may be aiming the Stugna up initially is because we can see that the Stugna anti-tank guided missile's path is very erratic. It kind of swishes around from left to right and up to down. And so I think this is to ensure that the missile doesn't hit the ground immediately out of the tube because of its erratic flight pattern. That may be another reason for it, but once again, that is just an assumption. We can now see the ATGM on its route to the Russian tank. And once again, another direct hit, another kill. And this is all in order. This is no cuts in this video. You've just seen this one Stugna unit take out 3 tanks. We can now see the Stugna once again reassessing for its target. It seems like the Stugna has now been reloaded. Yes, that must be the entire reason, because he actually puts the crosshairs dead on the tank. And if it was to stop the tank from getting lased, because I actually found out a while ago that some Russian tanks have a system where when they get lasered, by a distance measuring system, it actually picks up that laser and gives the tank automatic inputs saying where that laser came from, the distance, and then the tank's turret automatically turns in the direction of where that laser came from and fires around directly at where the laser originated from. It then reloads, it then adjusts 15 degrees to the left and fires some 10 seconds later, and then it does the same on the right side of where the crew was. So it's pretty much an active protection system that makes sure that carried anti-tank pieces like this Stugna cannot, and their crews will not survive lasering the tank directly. And so I think that him putting the crosshairs kind of shows that they're apparently not lasering the tanks, and apparently this is to make sure that the Stugna's missile does not hit the ground immediately after launch. So with that, we're now going to continue the video.
Выстрел!
We can now see the Stugna firing. And as you can see right there, I think that's exactly why, because we've seen this in every single one of the clips, and it was perfectly shown there. When the Stugna fires, it comes down incredibly quickly. So I do think that the entire reason of doing that is to make sure that the Stugna's missile doesn't go straight into the ground just 100 yards away from the launcher. So with that, we can now see the Stugna well on its way. Of course, the operator is now angling downwards onto the tank. And that is the 4th kill in this video alone. We can now hear the order being given to reload the piece. And it seems like they were reloading the piece at the very end of that video. Unfortunately, we don't know if they went on to get a 5th or a 6th tank, but 4 tanks from one Stugna crew in an uninterrupted video where we know that it happened in that quick of succession, one after the other, is amazing and impressive to see. And I have to give it to these Ukrainian anti-tank crews because they are doing untold amounts of work and untold amounts of damage on Russian armor and their ability to continue this war. So with that, we're now going to get off of that bit of location unknown news, and we're going to move to the last bit of news that we got from day 61. We can actually hear from a survivor from Mariupol that apparently made it out of the city in some kind of humanitarian corridor, that the Chechens fear the Azov. Their entire lives in the Azov area, well, the Mariupol area, I guess you could call it the Azov Sea area, is in fear of the Azov battalion that is currently still inside the Azovstal. So I'm going to let y'all see this footage. And before I show this to y'all, there's a lot of y'all who were around a while ago, and this has kind of been a bit of a subject of fiery debate in the comment sections about what the last video of a survivor's testament was. And it was an old woman, and she said, according to a lot of y'all, and I just want to correct this again because that wasn't the case, a lot of y'all believed that the woman said that the Ukrainian tank fired into her building and killed her son. The thing is that in the video, she was explaining what she had to do to survive and make sure the Russians wouldn't kill her, is that she lied and said it was a Ukrainian tank, although earlier in the video, she said it was a Russian tank. So I'm just wanting to clear up that story for everyone before we move on to the next eyewitness account. And so with that, here is this one. And this guy is a wonderful orator and storyteller. So I'm going to let y'all see the video.
Супер. Азов это супер. Супер. Вся Россия, все россияне, мы с кем приходилось общаться с россиянами, они как огня боятся. Они мне спрашивают, ты видел Азов? Я говорю, видел. Ну, честно признаться, им же страшно, вы сами понимаете, потому что от них все можно ожидать. Особенно чеченцы. Говорит, мы зачищаем район, зачищаем, они сзади нас. Раз, та-та-та-та, и все. Да, они постоянно об этом говорят. Азов, мы, и как бегают, зашли в квартиру ко мне, в квартиру проверять. И это, как это, я говорю, как трусливые зайцы, это вообще позорище, российская армия.
Now that's the most honest assessment. That's a perfect assessment of the Russian army from this guy here, is that the Russian army is an embarrassment. We've seen over 2 months of footage on this channel that is in fact the case. But anyways.
Потому что мы это все своими глазами видели. Это не то, что я, а я именно все видел, как он. Я ему говорю, да тут никого нет, пустая квартира уже. А он вот так идет, как вот так, идет, прям трясется, что боится, что это вообще.
It's good to know that a few of them made it out alive. In fact, these are the same yellow buses that we saw entering Zaporizhia a while ago. The few buses that actually made it through the humanitarian corridor and back with some people from Mariupol. Only 79 of them, and this is one of those 79 people, and the stories he has to say about how the Chechens were behaving off camera in Mariupol. And that gives you a totally different perspective of the Chechens now, because we knew that they were fakers. We've known that from the start. They were never really in firefights. Every time we saw them, it was all staged. And now we're hearing from this guy, whenever they were actually on the front, they were scared to death of running into the Azov. Apparently the Azov, in this war, since, if I had to compare it to an infantry unit from World War II, apparently it seems a lot like the Chechens are viewing the Azov like US GIs were viewing the SS in World War II. It was the most feared unit to go up against, although we know that the SS wasn't as effective in combat as they were believed to be, much like the Tiger tank wasn't as effective of a tank as it was perceived to be. But nonetheless, it's an incredibly interesting story to hear that the Chechens were actually freaking out the entire time and scared to actually get in any kind of fight with the Azov. So with that, we're now going to move on to the well, actually, we're not going to move on to any location unknown news. I just saw that we've actually run out of day 61 location unknown news. So with that, that is the end of the location unknown news. We're now going to move on to the Kharkiv area and the northern area of the Donbass. This will include Luhansk, and then we will take 3 to 5 questions around Orlivka, and then continue our news on into the southern front. So with that, I now have to show y'all an incredibly interesting picture set of a Ukrainian S-25, I believe is the correct designation, 2S1, I'm sorry, correction, firing from a concealed position, and the concealment was incredibly well done. I mean, like, you can just look at this and say, wow, you wouldn't really be able to tell an SPG is in there if you were taking a quick glance at a tree line. So they've done an incredibly good job at hiding this SPG, and hopefully there's raining hellfire on the Russians. As you can see there, it's pretty difficult to see rather than the muzzle brake itself. So once again, wonderful job from the Ukrainians in their concealment job. We've seen the Russians try and do similar things on their tanks, usually in an open plain, which makes no sense, and it doesn't really look all too well, and it's pretty obvious what they're doing. With the Ukrainians, however, they've actually picked an incredibly smart position, dug it out in the tree line, and then covered the tank with dead tree branches, much like the trees surrounding it, which has given it a perfect concealment, and I have to say, wonderful job on their part. With that, we're now going to move on away from the outsides of Kharkiv, and we've now seen a small shift in the battlefield near Kharkiv. More specifically, the Ukrainians have moved further east, and they're now starting to head towards the Seversky Donets River. Forgive me if I got the pronunciation wrong, but we do know that today the Ukrainians have managed to take 5 villages. This marker just says that. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the Ministry of Defense's little tweet about that on here. I don't know why, but nonetheless it wouldn't travel over, and so unfortunately I just had to put that there just so that way there was a mark made about it. That's incredibly good news because, as you may know, if you've been watching the stream for a while or a huge aficionado of the news, you can actually know that the Russians have been in a renewed offensive here in the southeast of the country for about an entire week at this point, and the Russians are still losing ground, although they should be gaining ground. That's what an offensive is for, and we can see that this offensive is nothing more than a glorified, I guess you could call it struggle of defense, because they're not managing to gain any meaningful ground. They're in fact losing more ground than they're gaining in this offensive. So with that, we're now going to move away from the Kharkiv area, and we're going to move to Izium, where we can see on day 61, another Stugna attack occurred near the area of Izium, and appeared to have wiped out another Russian tank. I'm sorry, correction. It looks like I actually identified where the Stugna attack in the location unknown occurred near Izium. So I'm going to skip past that bit of news. Apparently it's the same one. I just duplicated it and put it in Izium. And with that, we're now going to move on to the Luhansk area, where we've actually had a small amount of interesting news today. Although the Donbass in general, although this is believed to be Russia's goal now, has been relatively quiet compared to the remainder of the fronts here near Kharkiv, and also here in the south near Zaporizhia and Kherson as well. But as we can see in Luhansk today, and you also may have seen it in the Enforcer shorts that are now a new addition to this channel, the Luhansk ammo depot exploded today in some kind of Ukrainian attack. We're not really sure if it was an aircraft attack or an artillery or some kind of missile attack, but the depot did in fact get hit and was in the process of having severe detonations throughout. So you can see here the fire continues to rage. You can hear the small report of smaller explosions occurring after the large one at the start of the video. But of course, this is a huge logistical blow to the Luhansk People's Republic, because they, much like the Donbass People's Republic, are incredibly poor when it comes to their GDP and the ability for them to acquire new military supplies. So such a hit to them must be completely covered almost entirely by the Russians, because there's really no way for the Luhansk or the Donetsk People's Republics to replenish their own supplies. So with that, we can see that the Ukrainians have managed to hit a large blow on Luhansk, the Luhansk People's Republic's supply lines. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the area around Kharskiv, I believe is the pronunciation of that, where we can hear the sounds of shelling, which has actually made me have to reassess and change my front lines in this area, and we'll revisit that in a second. but you can hear an MLRS attack in the distance. We can see a dog running down the alley and away. Correction, that looks like... I'm not exactly sure what that looks like. It could be phosphorus or cluster, some kind of cluster munitions. But that's not a normal... I don't really know. I'm not really an artillery expert, and I can't really say what exactly it is, but I'm going to let y'all in the chat, because a lot of y'all are experts and have former military service and may be able to identify what kind of munitions is being used in that specific clip. But as you can see right there through the tree line, that is not the usual kind of artillery that we've seen used in this war. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the last bit of news that we've gotten in the Luhansk region, and then we will revisit the questions, answer 3 of them, and then we'll move on to the Donetsk news and cover the rest of the southern front as well. And so with that, here is Russian helicopters near Popasna. We can actually see a pretty wide variety of them in this video. We can see an Mi-28H, a Ka-52, and also an Su-25, which is not a helicopter, it's a plane, but here's the video. And of course, we'll probably see the usual Russian tactic where they tilt up, fire their unguided rockets, and then turn around and leave the area. We now see a Ka-52 leaving the combat zone, while the other 2 were flying towards it. We can now see them doing the rocket attacks in the distance. Of course, the usual tactic of aiming the helicopter upwards, letting it gain altitude, and then firing the rockets towards Ukrainian targets. We now see an Su-25 flying over the same apartment building, and also a second one out there in the distance. This has got to be the most active area of airspace we've ever seen in this war on the Russian side. Usually we only see helicopters in action or aircraft. We never see both in the same area around the same time. So that's a bit of a new bit of video. It's showing that there's a little bit of a higher density, at least in that area, of Russian aerial action as far as helicopters and aircraft are concerned. And with that, we have reached the end of this news segment, and we're going to answer 3 questions from the chat, and then we're going to return back to the news and cover the rest of the Southern Front news. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
All right, so first up, we have a $50 donation from Mark Piergrossi, who says, "Love the channel. I've been here since day 1. That Cossack would make a great merch t-shirt."
Well, thank you so much for the support, and that's really cool to hear you've been here since day 1. I think you're talking about day 1 is in like the first hours of the war, and that's crazy. Like, there's not a lot of y'all because there wasn't a lot of y'all in the first place. So I thank you so much for the support, and I thank you for hanging out with the channel this long and being here on day 62, which is a really long time for a war to go on, and a really long time for it to keep people's attention. But I'm glad that a lot of people care, because we continue to do great amounts of support and help for nonprofit causes that are still operating inside of Ukraine. So I'm very glad that you do enjoy the content that we put out here and the news that we deliver, because we try our best to get the most accurate news and as much of it as possible. So I thank you once again for your support. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And next up, we have a $23 donation from Anders Olsen, who says, "Do you think the Ukrainians have the military capability to destroy the Crimea bridge to Russia?"
I'm not exactly sure if they have that ability now, because I believe if they did, they would have already done it. The Crimean bridge is critically important to Russian logistics, and so destroying it would be a large damper, if not liability, on the Russians and how they would supply the entire, I guess you could say, western area of their southern front. So I believe if they had the ability, they would have already struck out at it. So with that in mind, I don't believe they have the ability as of yet, but I'm pretty sure that there's some kind of talks of delivering weapons to the Ukrainians from a Western country that may have the ability to strike at the bridge and destroy it. So I hope that answers the question, and I thank you so much for the support. And with that, we're going to move on to the last question of this segment, and then return right back to the news in the Donetsk and southern areas. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
So the last one of this segment goes to a longtime channel supporter, Praise Adonai, who puts in a $20 donation and says, "At Enforcer and Matt, I believe Putin is on the verge of losing his cool. When he goes into an outrage when this occurs, what do you think his response will entail? Will he go nuclear? And God bless you guys and the job you're doing."
Well, thank you very much for the support, and I'm glad that we always get so much support here on the channel for the amount of effort we put into running these streams. Of course, I put together the map entirely on my own, and Matthew does a lot of the stuff in the background. He's the one who runs the merchandise shop and such things like that, and he's doing a huge amount of work, so huge thanks to him as well. And to answer that question, I'm not really sure what Putin will do. The war is, of course, going terrible. There's really no way for him to get around that, and so there will have to be a point where they have to give up. They just cannot continue to take these kinds of losses statistically. And so I'm not exactly sure what he'll do. I'm not really sure if he'll try and rephrase the whole entire thing to where it sounds like we won and we achieved our objectives, because maybe they'll get something out of it, but it'll be incredibly small. It won't be their original objectives. I'm not exactly sure. I can't really weigh in on that, because I think the only person who can get into a lunatic's head like Putin's would be Putin himself. So I thank you so much for the support, and of course being a return supporter and viewer of the stream. But unfortunately, I just don't really know which direction it would go in, to be honest with you. So once again, I thank you so much for the support. And with that, we've reached the end of this question segment. Of course, all the super chats go to support this channel, and it's a huge deal here for us to continue to be able to do what we do. So I thank everyone so much once again for their support. And with that, we're now going to continue on with the news. Starting in an area near Donetsk, we've seen an interesting POV from inside of a Ukrainian tank's driver's port of a Ukrainian tank in action. So I'm going to let y'all see this video. It's crazy to see. I've never seen footage like this before. Now let me make sure I'm correct. Okay, yes, I am correct. It is a Ukrainian tank, because I saw the watermark here and I was like, is that Russian or not? But nonetheless, this is in fact a Ukrainian tank. And we see through the driver's port here that it is laying down the fire on the Russians in the distance. You see it, they're continuing a high rate of fire, and I think they're on the edge of a hill, because we can see that that tree is much lower than the tank probably is sitting. Nonetheless, I'm going to let the video continue. And with that, that is the end of that video. Once again, an incredibly interesting perspective of a tank operating. Usually we see it from the outside of the tank. We never see it from the inside of the tank. So, and especially from the driver's position at all. So that was a really interesting video to see, and it kind of gives you the perspective of what it looks like from the driver's position of a Ukrainian tank. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news. We're now going to move westwards into the Zaporizhia area, where we've seen today that there was a missile attack on the steel plant inside of Zaporizhia. I wasn't really sure if it was an aluminum plant or a steel plant, but nonetheless, here's the video. I've got to be entirely honest, this is very reminiscent of the first day of the war, when the cruise missiles flew into the first plants that they attacked, and people were running around in the exact same way, and the explosions occurred in the exact same style. It's just really weird. It's kind of a deja vu moment.
Еще одна где-то летит.
And with that, the video now loops, but once again we can see that the Russians are now striking at civilian targets. I believe they are marking as strategic resources, such as the aluminum plant here in Zaporizhia, and of course it is unfortunate to see that civilian structures are being attacked, but in this case it is somewhat understandable because it is an aluminum plant, but nonetheless, considering the record of the Russians attacking civilian targets without any military importance whatsoever, of course, to test any Russian attacks on any locations anywhere in Ukraine, including this aluminum plant. It's, of course, sickening to know that they are killing civilians every time they do this, and we know today that the Russians said, at the UN Security Council, I believe, that they killed the Ukrainians in Bucha Hospital Irpin area through artillery fire and not by direct gunfire, and so we're completely wiped of our sins. And that's just sickening, because we know that it wasn't artillery fire. They shot him in the back of the head. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news, where you can see the remains of a cruise missile falling to the ground, because apparently it was shot down by an Igla. This is wild to me. I didn't know that you could shoot down a cruise missile with an Igla, but I think the Ukrainians just found that out today. So you can see the cruise missile falling to the ground there, and that's the end of the video. It's just that, but that's insane to me. They actually shot down a cruise missile with an Igla. That's something I never thought you could actually do, but it looks like the Ukrainians have proved me wrong, so I'm happy to see that. And with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news here near Vasilivka, where we can see a Russian column being entirely destroyed by the 110th Separate Territorial Defense Brigade. So I'm going to let y'all see this. We can see here the burning remains of what appears to be 2 BMPs. This BMP has been abandoned, and we can also see a T-72B3 behind them. All of them smoldering wrecks, except for this one BMP-2, which has been abandoned. That means that the Russians, right there, lost 1/10. They lost 10% of a BTG's tank force. And then they lost around another 10% of their BTG's armored personnel carrier force. So once again, an incredibly good loss just to see in one area of film. They didn't even have to pan the camera around. This is just the losses in one spot. So you can get the idea of the losses that the Russians are taking across the entire front every single day, considering that this is just in one area. With that, we're now going to move on to Mariupol, where I'm so happy to say that we got only 3 pieces of news out of Mariupol today. This is, of course, showing that the Russians are no longer committing any kind of major offensives against the defenders in the Azovstal plant. Maybe small probing attacks, because that's normal, but nothing major like they once were, where they pushed the defenders all the way into the Azovstal plant in the first place. So starting off, on day 61, we can see the DPR firing at the Azovstal with some kind of rocket launcher. I'm not exactly sure what kind, but here's the video. We now see that he's fired the piece down towards the Azovstal, it seems. We can now see them running off. Of course, trying to act all cool, but we actually know from the eyewitness that was there that apparently they were scared to death. Well, not these guys, but the Chechens, at least, were scared to death of running into the Azov. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of Day 61 news before we move on to the Day 62 news, where we can see a UR-77 being used in Mariupol.
Сейчас при продвижении
We're going to skip forward past this guy talking because it's an ear rape. Don't want y'all to have to suffer through that. Honestly, this entire video has very bad audio, so I'm going to turn that down a little bit. We can now see the DR-77 moving forward. And we can also see them using a drone as well. We can see this guy here. I'm assuming he's the driver. He's having some kind of a drug withdrawal here because he's doing like the little like crack addict scratch thing on his face. Let's take a look at that again. Yeah, he's having a little bit of a meth withdrawal. But anyways, we now see the Russians running past. We can now see another crewman moving around his hatch here, more close to the launcher itself, I'm assuming. And we can now see it firing its projectile. I'm not really knowledgeable about this weapon system, but it was a very interesting bit of film, and for those of y'all who may know what it is, I wanted to show this just so that way y'all could see it. We now see the tank turning, and now it looks like we can see a larger perspective of this vehicle being used, and I think I know what this is now, because we saw a similar video come out of a different city some time ago. Yep, now I know what it is. Some kind of, I don't really know what to specifically call that thing. I don't know, a mine layer? Okay, a lot of people are calling it a mine clearer. So I'm assuming that that's what it is. I've seen a similar kind of system being used by the United States, but it shoots out these large duffel bag, well, not really duffel bag, sausage casing like, I guess you could call them socks. I don't know, but anyways, they're incredibly long. They fire out and the entire thing explodes. But this looks like it's shooting like a large explosive over a distance with a rope, and then the explosive at the very end of this wire / rope then explodes, like right here in this footage. I'm not really sure if they are using that as a mine clear or they're trying to attack the Azovstal with this thing, but nonetheless, it is a very interesting bit of film. So with that, that's the end of that video, and we're now going to move on to the last bit of news from inside of Mariupol. And I'm so glad that Mariupol is such a small bit of news today, because for a while, Mariupol was the fear on everyone's minds that the city would soon fall and that the Russians were putting a large amount of pressure on them, and everyone was hoping and praying that the defenders of the city would survive another day. And now we know that they'll be surviving for an incredibly long time, because it appears that the Russians have stopped most of their offensives, large offensives at least, to drive the Azov out, have largely been stopped. And so with that, we can now see pictures of a hospital that's in the Azovstal bunker. Of course, these kinds of pictures are not letting us concern less about Mariupol. Now we can see that people who require medical care in terrible conditions inside of the bunkers inside of the Azovstal. So I hope that a humanitarian corridor can be achieved to get these people, at least the severely wounded, out of the Azovstal area and to a place that can properly take care of them. It is, of course, very sad to see, and I hope that these people do get the care they need and that some kind of agreement is made where they can get out of there safely. And so with that, that is the end of the news in Mariupol. Of course, I don't have to give my usual disclaimer. If they've held this long, I don't know how much longer. They will hold for an incredibly long time now. We know that for sure. And with that, we're now going to move on to the area around Kherson, where today we've seen something incredibly interesting. We've seen the Ukrainians fire a Molan ATGM across the Dnieper River and hit a target on the other side. It appears that the Russians won't be able to move units across the coastline, I guess you could call it the shoreline of the Dnieper River and its reservoirs, because the Ukrainians will be on the other side, wiping their tanks out as fast as possible. Of course, I have to mute it because it has copyrighted music. We now see the Milan firing towards the other side of the bank and apparently hitting a Russian vehicle. That's pretty crazy. You know, I was thinking at some point, I wonder if they will do that, and it looks like they are. And there we are, the hit and the explosion from the hit. That's crazy to see, honestly. I didn't think that that's something that they would start doing, as exchanging fire across the Dnieper, but now we can see that that is the case, and that is incredibly interesting, of course. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news from around the country, where we can see in Odessa today, well, at least in the, I believe it's called, let me make sure I get it correct. Oh man, let me just go to the video. We can see that a bridge was damaged in the Dniester estuary. Yes, the Dniester estuary, where the Russians apparently attacked the bridge and wiped it out. This is one of the only major bridges to Romania in that area, and so this will put a huge hamper on Ukrainian citizens trying to escape the country as refugees into Romania.
Развертай машину, погнали нахуй. Развертай машину, кум. Давай бегом. Ебать, колотить. Нахуй быстро, в мост въебали. Быстрее, быстрее, быстрее. Бегом, погнали нахуй. А діти всі на місці? Ёбаный в рот.
So, an interesting sight, and I hate to see that because it kind of looks like a railway bridge, but the Ukrainian citizens are using that railway bridge, and if it was a road bridge as well, they're using both of those to escape into Romania. Now they may not be able to have the ability to do that because the bridge has been wiped out. I'm not really sure if the Russians did that because they believed that military supplies and arms were being sent from Romania to Ukraine. That may have been the reason why. But still, that's a sad sight to see, and I hate that that has been the case. With that, we're now going to move on to the last bit of news we've gotten for tonight. This is a bit of interesting news. Some people are calling it extreme. I believe it is extreme, but I can kind of understand it. Now, let me explain why. This video is about to show Russia beginning the day, there at this school by playing the Russian anthem. Now, it is a little bit extreme, but being an American, I can kind of understand it a little bit because every single day at our school, we would have to get up and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So I think this is trying to instill patriotism into the Russian, kids, but it's really weird that they're going to start doing this now instead of during